Hello everybody, welcome to my channel. Let's go on our topic. So, does the G wave encounter resistance during transmission? Certainly, as a kind of signal, the G wave propagates along the medium, which in itself indicates that it is subject to a resistance effect in non-propagation directions. If a GA is activated but cannot effectively activate GC by activating GB, then we can consider that the resistance between GA and GC is relatively large. Although GC is not effectively activated, this does not prevent GB from being strongly activated. For example, during an economic depression, a cake shop offers free cake samples to customers. After tasting, the customers want to buy but ultimately don't. That is, the merchant activates the customer's eating instinct G by providing free samples, which in turn strongly activates the customer's appetite G and purchasing G, but fails to but fails to effectively activate the G unit of the motor instinctive G that implements the purchasing behavior. We know that for the activation of the final motor instinctive sub-G, the vector effect of the corresponding G wave needs to win out. That is to say, whether it is effectively activated in the end is subject to the G environment in the brain. If we lengthen the chain of GA activating GC through GB, we can infer that when activating the end through the beginning of the chain, each G is a node. Some students say that each G is a hurdle. This understanding is suitable for the example we just gave. However, there may also be a situation where a G at a certain node is activated extremely weakly, but the small amount of G wave generated by this weak activation strongly activates the G at the next node, thus making the subsequent multiple nodes proceed smoothly. A common example is when doing a math proof problem, a tiny clue suddenly makes people realize the key to solving the problem. That is, a weak G wave combined from the existing activated G strongly activates the expected G, and the entire chain instantaneously changes from a state of a high resistance to a state of a low resistance. That is to say, in the entire conduction chain, a certain node G can be either a resistance point or a gas station of the entire conduction chain. Although we summarize this conduction as a chain structure, you must develop a network like logical thinking. For example, when the purchasing G of the customer is strongly activated after eating the free cake in the previous paragraph, the formed G wave will be projected onto the cognitive G of their own financial difficulties, thus activating this cognitive G and generating a G wave that antagonizes the purchasing behavior G wave. This antagonistic conduction chain, the activation of each node may trigger the activation of one or more other G. The activation of this G can, on one hand, generate two G waves with vector opposing directions, and on the other hand, participate in the combination of characteristic internal structures of all the activated G, thus playing a role in whether to activate the next node. And whether the next node is activated affects whether the entire conduction chain continues. Therefore, a certain node G becomes a resistance point. One reason is that the G wave that can activate the node G in the vector effect of the existing activated G waves does not win out sufficiently. The other reason is that the G waves of the existing activated G do not combine to form a characteristic internal structure G wave that activates this code G. Otherwise, this node G will be activated and then activate other G related to this node G, thus becoming a gas station or making the next node G a resistance point. This chain structure and the network, like logic, is actually very similar to the chains of stock and futures. We can regard some sudden upward or downward trend around as the result of the activation of a certain combined view of a part of market participants to a certain extent. That is, as the G wave of this combined G, then the G wave will be projected, activating a series of combined G um, of G2 of market participants related to grade, fear, or other contents. The G wave of this combined G2 will be reflected in the chain, and the G waves of combined G2 and the original combined G, that is, the two existing trend waves, will activate the combined G3 of market participants, thus forming the third trend wave. Note that the type of combined G1, 2, and 3 are neither completely the same nor completely different, and the participants included can also vary greatly. Moreover, the division of combined G and each trend wave is consistent with the multi-meaning and divisibility, combinability of G, and it is just a general term without strict boundaries. If you have philosophical thinking, it is not difficult to find that the trend chart is just a visual and materialized representation of the relationship between G and G wave. And the G wave directions are only long and short, which is even simpler. Alright, in this chapter, we introduce the chain structure and the network like logic in the transmission of G waves, and recognize the two possibilities of a node becoming a resistance point or a gas station. If we have a sufficient understanding of a patient's G environment, then when the patient is resistant to conventional methods, we can set up such a chain or network structure. Through subtle influence or an indirect approach, we can achieve the goal of activating certain G in their brain for effective treatment. This method is theoretically absolutely valid. However, the key is to have sufficient control over the patient's brain environment. Deduce and classify all possible steps in the process, and at the same time, firmly grasp the activity characteristic of Ju, such as rhythmicity or gradual change. Alright, everyone, that's all the content today. How do you feel? And leave the comments below. See you next time. Bye bye.